Something has changed in the world, but most people cannot explain what it is. It's not just one event. It's not just one war, one disaster, or one crisis. It feels deeper than that, almost invisible, yet constantly present. People describe it differently. Some say the world feels heavier. Others say it feels unstable. Some say it feels like something is about to happen, but no one knows what. And strangely, this feeling is now becoming global. But here's the real question. What if this feeling is not just psychological, but prophetic? Because Jesus once described a generation that would experience exactly this kind of atmosphere before the end. A world filled with fear, confusion, and uncertainty. A world where people would sense something shifting, but most would fail to understand what it means. And that is where things become unsettling. Because right now, humanity is experiencing global instability at a level that feels different from past generations. Wars are no longer isolated. They affect entire continents. Economic instability is no longer regional. It spreads globally within hours. Natural disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity. Moral values are shifting rapidly. Truth feels harder to recognize, and yet life continues normally for most people. That contradiction is where the curiosity begins, because how can everything feel like it is changing, yet life still looks normal on the surface? Jesus actually warned about this exact condition. In Matthew 24, he described a world experiencing wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, and increasing fear. But he also warned something even more important, that people would be spiritually unprepared. In other words, they would see the signs, but not understand them. And that raises a disturbing possibility. What if the signs are not missing? What if people are simply not recognizing them? There's a difference between information and understanding. The world today has more information than ever before. News spreads instantly. Events are broadcast globally in real time. Yet despite this, spiritual understanding seems to be decreasing. People are informed but not aware, connected but not discerning, exposed to truth but unable to interpret it. And maybe that is why this generation feels different. Because for the first time in history, all the conditions Jesus described are happening simultaneously across the world, not in one region, not in one century, but globally in real time. Wars, deception, moral collapse, fear, disasters, and spiritual confusion are all increasing together. That alone creates a question many people avoid asking. Are we simply living through another difficult era or something more significant? And even more importantly, why does it feel like it is accelerating? Because one of the most overlooked aspects of prophecy is not just what is happening, but how quickly it begins to happen once the conditions are set. And right now, the world does not feel like it is slowing down. It feels like it is speeding up. And that is where the deeper investigation begins. One of the most striking signs described in Scripture is not just global chaos, but global confusion. A world where truth becomes difficult to recognize, where deception spreads easily, where people believe things that contradict reality, yet still feel convinced they're right. Jesus warned that deception would be one of the defining characteristics of the last days. And if you look closely at the modern world, deception is no longer hidden. It is everywhere. But here's the deeper question. Why does deception feel more effective now than ever before? Because information alone does not produce truth. In fact, too much information without wisdom often produces confusion. Today, people are exposed to more voices than any generation in history. Social media, news platforms, political commentary, influencers, and constant digital noise all compete for attention. And in the middle of all that noise, truth becomes harder to identify. And here's the curiosity spike. What if confusion itself is becoming a global condition? Because when Jesus spoke about the last days, he did not only describe external events like wars and disasters, he also described internal conditions within humanity: fear, anxiety, deception, loss of love, increase in lawlessness. These are not just global events, they are emotional and spiritual states. Paul expanded on this in 2 Timothy 3 when he described a generation characterized by selfishness, pride, greed, lack of self-control, and a rejection of truth. That description doesn't sound ancient anymore. It sounds familiar, almost uncomfortably familiar. But something even more concerning is happening alongside this: moral reversal. Things that were once considered wrong are now defended as right. Things that were once considered truth are now questioned as opinion. Moral boundaries are dissolving, and as those boundaries dissolve, confusion increases. And here's the key connection: confusion always creates vulnerability. A confused society is easier to influence. A distracted society is easier to mislead. A fearful society is easier to control emotionally, and a spiritually disconnected society becomes easier to shape through external forces rather than internal conviction. This is why the Bible repeatedly warns about discernment in the last days, because without discernment, people will not recognize what is happening even while they are inside it. And that leads to another question: if deception is increasing globally, what happens to truth? Truth does not disappear, but it becomes less accepted, less popular, less believed, and eventually less recognized. That is why Jesus asked a haunting question in Luke 18, "When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" That question suggests a world not lacking religion, but lacking true spiritual understanding. And that brings us closer to the real issue behind why the world feels different today. It's not just events changing, it's people changing with them. And that transformation may be more significant than the events themselves.
Something else is happening globally that many people notice but cannot fully explain: emotional exhaustion. People feel tired even when life is not physically demanding. Anxiety is rising across nations, depression is increasing globally, stress has become a normal part of daily life, and even young generations are experiencing emotional pressure at levels previously associated with older generations. But why? On the surface, life has become more comfortable in many ways. Technology has reduced physical labor, communication is instant, access to information is unlimited. Yet despite these advantages, emotional stability seems to be declining. And here is the question that shakes the minds of everyone. What if the problem is not physical, but spiritual atmosphere? Because Scripture suggests that the last days are not only marked by external events, but by internal pressure on humanity. Jesus said that people's hearts would fail them for fear of what is coming upon the earth. That statement implies an emotional condition affecting entire populations. And that is exactly what we are beginning to see. Fear is no longer tied to one event. It has become continuous. War fear, financial fear, health fear, future fear, climate fear, political fear. People are not just reacting to events anymore. They're living inside a constant emotional tension. And this tension creates something deeper: distraction. When people are overwhelmed, they stop thinking deeply. They focus on survival, not reflection. They react instead of discerning. And that shift is critical in understanding why spiritual awareness is decreasing. Because distraction is not just about entertainment, it is about mental saturation. When the mind is saturated, it stops processing deeper meaning. And when spiritual meaning is no longer processed, prophecy becomes irrelevant to daily life. But Scripture repeatedly warns against this condition. Jesus compared the last days to the days of Noah. People were living normal lives, eating, drinking, marrying, building, until sudden destruction came. The key detail is not the normal life, but the lack of awareness. And here is the disturbing parallel. Modern life is extremely normal on the surface, yet understable globally. People wake up, go to work, scroll through their phones, consume news, worry, repeat. Life continues, but underneath that normal rhythm, global instability increases. Wars escalate, morality shifts, economies shake, natural disasters increase, and yet most people adapt to it emotionally so quickly that it becomes background noise. That adaptation is important because it shows how quickly humanity can normalize instability. And when instability becomes normal, warning signs lose urgency. That is one of the most dangerous conditions described in prophecy, when people no longer recognize urgency even while danger increases. And that brings us closer to the final question. If everything is increasing, why does awareness seem to be decreasing? One of the most overlooked warnings in Scripture is not just about events happening in the world, but how people interpret those events. Jesus repeatedly emphasized watching, discerning, and understanding, not just seeing, because seeing without understanding leads to spiritual blindness. And that brings a critical question. What if the problem is not what is happening, but how it is being understood? Because modern society does not lack information, it lacks interpretation. Every major event today is instantly broadcast globally. Wars, disasters, crises, scandals, all visible in real time. Yet despite this visibility, the meaning behind these events is often debated, confused, or ignored. And that raises a deeper issue. When everything becomes information, nothing feels significant anymore. This is where desensitization begins. Repeated exposure to global chaos creates emotional fatigue. People no longer respond strongly to alarming events because new ones quickly replace them. Over time, urgency fades, concern decreases, awareness weakens. But Scripture describes a generation that would be spiritually asleep even while significant events unfold. Not spiritually asleep in awareness, but sleep in a wakefulness. And that leads to another question. How does spiritual sleep happen in an active world? It happens gradually, through distraction, through normalization, through emotional overload, through constant engagement with temporary concerns, and perhaps most importantly, through the loss of reflection. Because reflection is where understanding forms. Without reflection, events remain just events. With reflection, patterns begin to appear, and patterns are what lead to awareness of prophecy. But in a world moving extremely fast, reflection becomes rare. People rarely stop long enough to ask deeper questions. Why is the world changing? Is this normal? Is there a pattern? What did Scripture say about this? And that lack of reflection creates a dangerous gap between events and understanding. That gap is where confusion grows. And confusion, once again, is one of the strongest signs described in the last days. Because confused people don't recognize direction. And without direction, urgency disappears. And when urgency disappears, awareness disappears next.
At the center of everything discussed so far is a single reality. The world feels different because it is different. Not necessarily in one dramatic moment, but in accumulation, layer upon layer of global instability, moral shift, emotional exhaustion, and spiritual distraction. And here is the final thought-provoking question. What if this feeling people cannot explain is actually recognition of prophecy unfolding? Because even though many ignore it, something deep inside humanity notices change. That is why phrases like "something feels off" or "the world feels strange" have become increasingly common across cultures. But Scripture provides a framework for understanding that feeling. Jesus warned that the last days would be marked by fear, deception, instability, and spiritual unawareness. Paul warned about moral collapse and self-centered societies. Isaiah warned about moral reversal. Daniel described increasing knowledge and global movement. Revelation describes a world moving toward final conflict and judgment. When all these descriptions are placed together, a pattern emerges, not of isolated events, but of convergence, multiple conditions developing simultaneously across the world. And that convergence is what creates the feeling many people cannot explain. But the most important question remains: what should awareness lead to? Because prophecy in Scripture is never given only for observation. It is given for response. Awareness is meant to lead to reflection. Reflection is meant to lead to spiritual awakening, and awakening is meant to lead to transformation. That is why these signs matter. Not to create fear, but to create clarity. Because a generation that recognizes the signs still has the opportunity to respond differently. And maybe that is the most important point of all. The world may feel different because it is calling attention to something deeper, something humanity has been warned about for thousands of years. And the question now is not whether the signs exist. The question is whether people will finally see them clearly enough to respond.